Patton said no to retreat and changed the Battle of the Bulge forever. On the morning of December 19, 1944, inside a freezing stone schoolhouse on the outskirts of Verdun, three of the most powerful men in the Western world sat down to decide whether the Allied war in Europe could survive another week. Outside the windows, the sky over France was low and colorless, and the maps covering the long conference table had been redrawn so many times in the last 72 hours that the creases had split the tablecloth underneath. To the south, 25 miles of black German arrows were stabbing into the Ardennes, swallowing American towns, splitting Allied armies apart, and pointing straight toward the Meuse. To the north, the British were burning their own fuel dumps and preparing to pull back to Brussels. Inside that room, General Omar Bradley, the calm and exhausted commander of the 12th Army Group, was quietly telling his superior, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, that the situation was, in his careful words, serious. Eisenhower had the look of a man who had not slept in 4 days. Then the door at the end of the hall banged open, and George S. Patton walked in. He was not dressed like the others. His helmet was still strapped under his chin. His gloves were crusted with dried mud from his Jeep. His boots had not been polished in what looked like a year. And before he even sat down, before he even accepted the coffee an aide pressed into his hands, Patton looked at Eisenhower and said words that nobody in that room believed would be possible a week earlier. He said, "I can attack tomorrow morning with 3 divisions, and I can have a 4th division in position by the day after. We can take the tip of the German penetration off Bradley's back." The room went quiet. Bradley, who had just spent 90 minutes explaining why almost nothing could be done, blinked. Eisenhower, who had been gathering officers around him for what he privately believed was going to be a desperate defensive plan, stared. Because what Patton was describing was not a small counterattack. What Patton was describing was the unheard of, the absurd, the geometrically insane maneuver of taking an entire American army that was facing east, that was dug in along the Saar, that was aimed at Frankfurt and the industrial heart of Germany, of pivoting that army 90 degrees on a frozen road in the middle of winter and throwing it north into a storm of German panzers to rescue an army that was not his own. He was offering, in other words, to save the American war in Europe with a single act of mind-bending audacity. And then he said the 7 words that changed history forever. He said, "Hell, let's have the guts to let the son of a bitch go all the way." Eisenhower nodded, and from that moment forward, the Battle of the Bulge stopped being a German victory and started being the moment the Allies broke the back of Nazi Germany for good. But Patton's defiance that morning did not begin in that schoolhouse. It had been building inside his mind for weeks, hidden, mocked, ignored, and prepared in total silence. For almost the entire autumn of 1944, while Allied generals on every front were publicly celebrating the collapse of the German Reich, George Patton had been quietly studying a single terrifying possibility. What if the Germans were not yet finished? What if, in their last desperate gamble, they threw everything west through the Ardennes, through the same hills and forests where Hitler had victoriously smashed France in 1940, and separated the British and American armies permanently? Patton did not publish his fears. He told almost nobody, but by mid-November, in his 3rd Army headquarters in the Lorraine, in a brick schoolhouse of his own, he had begun to draw up what he called his contingency study. It was a detailed battle plan, 42 pages long, that laid out how the 3rd Army could, on short notice, abandon its eastward attack toward Germany, wheel its 3 full corps north, and drive straight into the flank of any German offensive emerging from the Ardennes. His staff officers thought it was a fantasy. His own chief of operations warned him that Eisenhower would never approve abandoning the Saar offensive. His own war diary shows that Patton not only refused to listen, he ordered his subordinate commanders to memorize the routes, the bridges, the crossroads. He made his logistics chief pick where every drop of gasoline would sit, where every tank would refuel, where every truck would stage. He called it, behind closed doors, the plan nobody wants, and then he waited. For 37 days he waited, while Eisenhower toured the front, while Bradley bragged about the strength of the position, while the official Allied intelligence report on December 5th, through the responsibility, declared that the Germans were incapable of mounting any major offensive. That document reached every commanding officer in the army. It was signed and stamped and confident and utterly, catastrophically wrong. On December 16th, at 5:30 in the morning, while the soldiers of the First Army were watching home movies in requisitioned Belgian houses, eating Christmas treats mailed from back home, lying gently in bunks warmed by little stoves, the German guns opened all at once, along an 84-mile front. 16 German divisions, including 2 full SS Panzer Corps, hit the rough, thinly manned, supposedly quiet shoulder of the American line, with the most concentrated artillery barrage of the entire war in the West. By dawn, the forward command posts of 2 entire American divisions had vanished. By noon, the Schnee Eifel had been overrun, and 8,000 American soldiers were surrendering by the thousands, the largest mass capitulation of American troops in the history of the United States. By nightfall of the first day, the Germans had punched a hole 25 miles wide and 12 miles deep into the Allied line. Within 48 hours, the Bulge was already so enormous that American civilians back home were reading about it in their newspapers and would soon give the entire campaign its forever name, the Battle of the Bulge. The blow fell hardest on the First Army, the army of Courtney Hodges, the quiet and careful general who had simply not been given enough men to hold the line. Hodges was not incompetent. His soldiers were not cowards. They were outnumbered 4-1 in many places. They were caught at rest, not at combat readiness. They were staring into the same snowy hills that they had been told were permanently secure. When the assault began, Hodges made the only honest call a man in his position could make. He reported to Bradley, accurately, that his army had been broken in the center. He asked, with dignity, what reinforcements were available. He waited for the response that would save his command. That response did not come from his own resources. It did not come from the British, who were already buckling under their own separate German attack in the north. It did not come from the reserves that everyone assumed existed in quiet pools deeper behind the lines. It came, when it came, from George Patton, and the road that the response had to take was the most dangerous road in the entire war. Across the Allied command structure in Belgium, France, and England, the mood on December 16th, 17th, and 18th collapsed in slow motion. Eisenhower had been hoping to finish the war by Christmas. By that weekend, he was frantically searching for any combination of divisions that could plug the dam. Bradley sat in his headquarters watching the front bend and snap. The British chiefs of staff in London were preparing the emergency destruction of their own supply depots in case Belgium fell. Winston Churchill himself was cabling Roosevelt that the situation was, in careful diplomatic language, alarming. And in Patton's army, deep in the Lorraine along the Saar River, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers, tank crews, artillerymen, engineers, and support troops slept peacefully through the first 3 days of the greatest crisis their side would face in the Second World War. Because they were not the ones being hit. Because their line was quiet. Because their general had kept them ready for exactly this moment, even while every other Allied officer had insisted the moment would never come. Patton learned about the German offensive on December 16th, the same day it began, through routine intelligence channels, and his reaction was immediate and characteristic. He did not panic. He did not wait to be called. He did not ask permission. He walked into his operations room, pointed to the wall map, and asked his chief of staff, "Where are the German radios that we have been listening to? Are they in the Ardennes?" He was told they were. He asked, "Has the volume of traffic increased?" He was told it had increased by roughly 500% in the prior 72 hours. He said, almost to himself, "They are coming, and they are coming through the Ardennes." He turned to his staff and gave an order. He said, "Bring out the contingency study. We are going to war." And by God, the Third Army pivoted. Within 48 hours, 400,000 Americans along 100 miles of front began moving vehicles, tanks, artillery, fuel, ammunition, and supplies from an eastward-facing offensive into a northward-facing one. The lead combat command of the 4th Armored Division began moving on December 19th, just hours after Patton's promise in Verdun. By December 21st, 3 full divisions were on the road and heading north. By December 22nd, the first troops of Patton's army were crossing the German frontier again, this time running north, not east. An entire American army, with its tail still pointing toward Frankfurt, swung its fist into the flank of the German penetration. It was the most audacious operational maneuver executed by any side in the Second World War. And it worked, because Patton had been planning it, in secret, with mocking precision, for over a month. But there is a deeper story buried inside the maneuver. Patton had not simply won a planning competition with his fellow generals. He had won a fight with his own superiors, to even be allowed to mount the maneuver. On December 19th, inside the Verdun schoolhouse, Bradley did not simply mark Patton's promise on a map and send him home. Bradley looked at him with open disbelief. Bradley said, calmly but firmly, that he did not believe Patton could fully disengage from his Saar offensive in less than a week. He said that moving 3 divisions off a stabilized line, getting them refueled, reassigning their supply lines, and driving them north into a winter war was not a question of will, it was a question of logistics, and that the logistics would not hold. Patton did not object. He did not argue. He opened his own map case, pulled out the long-prepared study, set it on the table, and showed Bradley step by step exactly where each division would be on each day of the next 10 days. He showed him the roads. He showed him the railheads. He showed him the gasoline dumps. He showed him the pre-positioned reserve battalions. He showed him the medical evacuation routes. He showed him, in other words, that the answer to every single one of Bradley's logistical doubts had been pre-solved, weeks earlier, by a general who had been laughed at for taking the possibility of a German offensive seriously. Bradley studied the plan. His face changed. Eisenhower studied it too, and the order was given. From that moment, Third Army was released from its eastward mission and given the new mission of counterattacking the southern shoulder of the Bulge. The hinge of the entire Western War swung. While the Third Army was pivoting north across frozen French highways, the situation in Bastogne was becoming one of the most desperate chapters in the entire history of the American military. The crossroads town of Bastogne sat at the exact geographic center of the German penetration. Whoever held Bastogne held the road net that fed the Bulge. Whoever lost Bastogne let the Bulge roll freely west to the Meuse, and from the Meuse to the Channel ports, and from there to whatever final nightmare the German High Command was still dreaming about in the bunkers under Berlin. On December 20th, the American command in Bastogne was a thin crayon mark on a vast German flood. The garrison was the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, who had been pulled out of rest areas in France and rushed north on trucks, arriving exhausted, under-equipped, and undersupplied, deployed across a perimeter of 7 roads, each one mined, each one blocked by a single earth-moving tractor. Their commander was Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, a quiet artillery officer who had never commanded a surrounded city in his life, and who now held the survival of the entire Western Front in the hollow of his hand. The Germans closed the ring on December 21st. Overnight, the radios carried the unmistakable sound of tracked vehicles grinding through the freezing mud outside the perimeter, and by morning, the long gray lines of the Wehrmacht were sitting in farmers' fields around Bastogne, blocking every road into and out of the town. Inside the perimeter, the 101st Airborne had roughly 11,000 combat troops, perhaps 32 rounds of artillery per gun, no winter clothing for half the men, and no Christmas dinner. Their medical officers were operating on kitchen tables with the lights off because the electricity had been cut. Their cooks were serving canned rations warmed on burned-out stoves. Their chaplain was conducting midnight funerals in a courtyard behind a parish hall. McAuliffe, gray with cold and nerves, set up his command post in a cellar beneath a brick hotel and waited for the German demand that he knew would come. It came on the morning of December 22nd, signed by 4 German generals, demanding the honorable surrender of the town within 2 hours, or promising that the garrison would be annihilated. McAuliffe's response became history. To the astonishment of his staff, he dictated a one-word reply. He said, "Nuts." When his aide asked him to clarify that answer into military language, he said, to the German commander, "Nuts." The aide wrote back the word, "nuts," in capital letters on the German surrender demand and sent a surrender party out under a white flag to deliver the answer. And while Bastogne was preparing to be overrun, George Patton was already on his way. The story of how Patton's spearhead fought its way back into Bastogne is one vast mosaic of personal courage, mechanical failure, terrible weather, and relentless American stubbornness. On December 22nd, the lead elements of his 4th Armored Division began probing north through the forest roads south of the Bulge. By December 23rd, the lead combat command of the 4th Armored was hitting German infantry positions in the forests south of Bastogne at ranges of less than 100 yards. Visibility was so poor from the falling snow that tank crews could not see the infantry they were trying to suppress. German bazooka teams were thinning American armor at point-blank range. American tank destroyers were bogged down in mud so thick that the crews had to abandon 2 of every 5 vehicles and fight on foot. Fuel trucks could not reach the lead elements because the roads were choked with stalled German wagons. Medics were treating wounded in unheated barns. Officers who had been trained in the deserts of North Africa were now trying to operate in a frozen, foggy forest whose fir trees blocked every line of sight. And through all of it, Patton was on the radio, hour after hour, demanding to know the exact position of every combat command, every rifle company, every engineer platoon. He was not in the rear. He was not in a chateau. He was not in a warm office. He was on the road with his advance command post, in a jeep with a canvas cover and a broken heater, and several of his officers believed that the general was sleeping in his jeep, rather than admit to the world that he himself was as cold and frightened as his soldiers were. Behind his spearhead, Patton's staff was waging an even more desperate battle, a logistical battle that history has never told properly. The weather over the Ardennes in mid-December was so cold, so foggy, so wet, that Allied fighter bombers, the planes that on any other day would have made German daylight movements impossible, were grounded for almost the entire first week of the battle. Without air cover, the German columns could move freely in the morning and early afternoon, and they did, jamming the roads to Bastogne with armor, trucks, horse-drawn wagons, and infantry. The Allied air forces told Eisenhower that they could not operate in weather this bad. Eisenhower told Patton. Patton, a man whose entire career had been about controlling the conditions of his battles, did not argue with the weather. He did not accept it either. On December 14th, 2 days before the German offensive, Patton had picked up a field telephone, dialed his Third Army chaplain, and made one of the strangest, most controversial requests of the war. He asked Father James Hugh O'Neill to compose a prayer asking God to clear the weather so Allied air power could be released against the enemy. The prayer, an extraordinary document, was printed on a Third Army pamphlet, distributed to every soldier in Patton's command, and encouraged men to recite it. The chaplain who wrote it later said, with dry understatement, that he had been somewhat embarrassed by the request, but had nonetheless been careful to write a good one. The prayer was distributed. The weather cleared. There are those who say, with entirely straight faces, that this was a coincidence. The Allies certainly behaved as if it were not a coincidence. 5 days after the prayer was printed, on December 23rd, the weather over the Bulge finally cleared, and Allied fighter bombers appeared in the skies in enormous, dominating numbers, attacking every German column that showed movement, blasting the German logistical trains, dropping napalm into fuel trucks, strafing infantry on the snow, and eventually making the daylight movement of any German vehicle north of the Bulge impossible. The advance of the German offensive was slowed to a crawl. The armored spearhead stalled, and Patton's spearhead, jamming its way forward through the forests on the south side of the Bulge, finally had the air cover it needed. But this was not the deepest, or strangest, or most decisive fight Patton was waging. From the very first hour of the German offensive, Patton was fighting a political war at his own headquarters, in his own command, in his own army, a war against the verdict of his own superiors that his plan was reckless. The most important weapon in that war was a single piece of paper. Before dawn on December 19th, while still in his headquarters in the Lorraine, Patton dictated a memorandum to his chief of staff. It was a battlefield estimate. It was blunt, cold, and unforgettable. In it he stated, in writing, that the present German offensive in the Ardennes represented, quote, an opportunity for us, and not a defeat. He said that the German attack had exposed the flank of the entire German Western Front, that the precise response to such an exposure was not retreat but counterattack, and that Third Army could and should execute that counterattack in the days ahead. He sent this document to Bradley within minutes of dictating it. He sent copies to Eisenhower, and then he sent his operations officer, Colonel Paul Harkins, into the same Verdun schoolhouse where he himself had already promised the impossible, to walk Bradley through the unit-by-unit timetable by which the impossible would become real. Bradley read Patton's memorandum. Eisenhower read Patton's memorandum. They both read the words, "an opportunity," and they understood, suddenly, that the man who dictated them had not been guessing. He had been preparing. And so on December 19th, when Patton told Eisenhower that he could attack with 3 divisions the next morning, he was making a promise that depended, for its truth, on one single condition that could not be guaranteed by any general: the weather. 3 days of flying weather above the Ardennes. 3 days that would let Allied fighter bombers shred the German reinforcements trying to move into the southern shoulder of the Bulge. 3 days that would let Patton's 4th Armored Division, his 26th Infantry Division, and his 80th Infantry Division push north through the forests into Bastogne. Without air cover, Patton's promise was a promise of senseless slaughter. With air cover, it was the salvation of the Western Front. And so the entire 48-hour operational clock that Patton was promising became a bet not on himself, but on the sky. He had bet on the sky 5 days earlier, when he asked Father O'Neill for a prayer. The prayer had been delivered. He bet on the sky again on December 19th, when he stood up in Verdun and made his promise. The sky was not in his command, but the sky had listened to his prayer. And on December 23rd, when the clouds opened, and the P-47 Thunderbolts and the P-38 Lightnings came screaming down into the German columns, Patton's bet was paid in full. At the front on December 23rd, the 101st Airborne in Bastogne was being hammered by German attacks from 3 sides. American medics were amputating frozen limbs at the casualty clearing station in the basement of a butcher's shop. Chaplains were giving last rites in foxholes. Officers were sharing carbines with privates to keep 2 men alive per squad. Ammunition was being rationed by counting bullets in each division's logistics truck. The Germans were using tanks to smash houses that contained American rifle positions. They were using flamethrowers against the green paratroopers who had never been trained for static winter defense. They were firing 88mm guns directly down the streets of Bastogne from positions only a few hundred yards away. And through every hour of that siege, McAuliffe stood in his cellar command post, sending one sentence over the radio to Patton. One sentence, day after day, until it became the most quoted sentence of the entire battle. He kept saying, "We are still here. We are still here." Patton heard that report with the rest of the world, and his response, in his own headquarters, was to push his tank crews harder than he had ever pushed any soldiers in any war he had ever fought. The story of how the relief column fought its way to Bastogne in the next 4 days is a story of total American combat aggression. On December 24th, Patton's lead combat command was 17 miles south of Bastogne. The route north was a single 2-lane blacktop road through German-held forest. The road was mined every half mile. The road was blocked by German tanks. The road was watched by German infantry firing from ridgelines invisible to the advancing American crews. The lead brigade lost 4 Sherman tanks in the first 6 hours to single shots from German Panther tanks, and the brigade commander, Colonel Bruce Clark, brought his surviving tanks off the road, went cross-country through the forest, found an old farmer's lane on the far side of a frozen creek, and drove his battered column up that lane at 15 miles an hour, with guns blazing, until his lead platoon was in a small Belgian hamlet called Assenois. From the hamlet, the road to Bastogne was a straight line. It was 6 miles long. Every inch of it was under direct German observation. Clark's lead tanks started rolling at 4:30 in the afternoon. By 5 o'clock, the lead American tank, a Sherman named Cobra King, driven by a 31-year-old sergeant from Illinois named Harold Sagendorf, was rolling toward the southern perimeter of the Bastogne perimeter. German fire came in from 3 sides. American machine guns returned it. The Sherman's treads were chewing frozen mud. The radio inside the tank was screaming with traffic from McAuliffe's perimeter. The gunner in the turret was firing white phosphorus into the German positions on the right side of the road. And at 5 o'clock on December 26th, the lead Sherman of Patton's 4th Armored Division slid sideways through a snowed-in farm gate and rolled into the American perimeter at Bastogne. The first American soldier the crew met was a paratrooper running through the snow with a rifle and no shoes. He was so stunned at the sight of the tank that he stood still for a full second. Then he screamed, with tears running down his face, "God damn Americans!" And the siege of Bastogne was over. But the story does not end with the relief of Bastogne. The relief of Bastogne was only the most visible episode in a campaign that was still being fought in every forest, on every ridge, and on every frozen road across the southern shoulder of the Bulge. Through January of 1945, Patton's Third Army fought the most grinding, attritional, and sustained campaign of any American army in the Second World War. By the end of January, the Germans had been pushed back to the original line of the offensive. By February, the Bulge had been erased from every map in every headquarters in Europe. By March, Patton was sitting on the Rhine again, this time with his army in perfect condition, his fuel lines restored, his replacements absorbed, his tank crews refreshed, his officers seasoned, and he had his army. The army he had pivoted through 90 degrees in a winter storm on the strength of a single promise to a single commander in a single schoolhouse. What history has never sufficiently explained is the cold, cold nerve that Patton displayed in that schoolhouse on December 19th. Every senior officer in the room knew the stakes. Eisenhower knew that if the southern shoulder of the Bulge could not be held, the Americans would be forced to retreat to the Meuse, the British would be forced to retreat to Antwerp, and the two armies would be separated for the rest of the war. Bradley knew that if Patton was bluffing, the entire American position in France would collapse under the weight of false optimism. Patton's own staff did not believe he could really do what he promised. Even his own chief of operations wrote, in the diary that night, that the chief was not sure Patton was going to pull it off. And yet Patton stood up in the Verdun schoolhouse, looked his commander in the eye, and said, "We can attack tomorrow morning." And he said it in such a tone that nobody in the room was ever able to argue with him again. He said it because he had spent 37 days preparing his army to be pivoted north. He said it because he had already moved his gasoline forward before the offensive even started. He said it because he had already rehearsed his divisions on the new roads. He said it because he had personally walked the headquarters of every combat command in his army and told their commanders, in person, in advance, that when the order to move north came, they were to obey it without hesitation and without complaint. He said it because he knew, in his bones, that if he refused to do it, no one would. And that is the heart of the story, the dying ember that still burns when historians turn their lanterns onto Patton at the Bulge. It was not tactical genius alone. It was not just luck. It was not just operational brilliance. It was a single act of refusal, at the highest possible level of Allied command, to accept the idea that the only response to a German breakthrough was a defensive crouch. Patton said no. Patton said no to the mood of retreat that was settling across the Allied command structure. Patton said no to the panic that was beginning to eat the British chiefs of staff alive. Patton said no to the invisibility of the crisis in the dark of a Belgian winter. Patton said no to safety, to caution, to preservation, to the politics of the rear, to the immobilizing instinct that grips every army when it has been shocked. He said no to the whisper that said, retreat, fall back, surrender the initiative, wait for the Germans to exhaust themselves. He said no with one memorandum, one promise, one jump into a frozen jeep, and one prayer on the wall of his army. And from that refusal came the entire American counteroffensive that ended the war. In the days after Verdun, Patton sent his famous Order of the Day to his army. Its opening lines are the clearest expression of the defiance that had begun this entire remarkable chain of events. To the officers and men of the 3rd United States Army, Patton wrote, "The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us, and not a defeat. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us, and not a defeat. We are going to attack. Americans attack." That single phrase, Americans attack, circulated through the American division in the forests south of Bastogne and became a creed. Tank crews painted it on turrets. Infantry sergeants quoted it to their shivering squads along the frozen stretches of the Belgian frontier. Paratroopers in the Bastogne perimeter heard it over their radios and cried when they heard it. And Eisenhower, who had allowed Patton to continue after the Bulge, who had watched him recover his army inside 10 weeks, who had flown back to Washington to argue that Patton should lead the final drive into the heart of Germany. That same Eisenhower later wrote, in private letters to his wife, that Patton had been the single most decisive commander in the entire Ardennes campaign. He wrote that without Patton's pivot on December 19th, the German offensive would have reached the Meuse. Without Patton's spearhead reaching Bastogne on December 26th, the 101st Airborne would have been overwhelmed. Without Patton's continuing counterattack through January, the Bulge would not have been erased from any map that year. And without all of those things, the war in Europe would have stretched deep into 1946. So when any man or woman turns back now, 80 years later, to read the winter of 1944, when they stand for a moment in their imagination in front of that Verdun schoolhouse, when they look at the muddy Jeep and the cold crest on Patton's helmet, and the iced-over mustache, and the sharp, dry voice that told the two other men in the room that they still had a chance, they should know what it was, exactly, that he did. He did not merely change the plan of battle, he changed the emotional posture of the Allied High Command. He changed the engine of the entire Western War, from a defensive engine into an offensive engine. He changed, by one single defiant afternoon in a primary school, the rhythm with which the war would end. He changed forever the memory of the Battle of the Bulge, from the day the Germans almost won, into the day the Americans proved that they would not be denied. Patton said no to retreat, and the Allies won Europe. And that is the truest and the most forgotten story of the Second World War.